The little girl stood perfectly still in the center of the hospital room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, eyes fixed on absolutely nothing. Her father, one of the wealthiest men in America, knelt beside her with tears streaming down his face, begging her to speak just one word, any word, but she didn't even blink. The team of world-renowned doctors stood helplessly in the doorway, their expensive degrees and decades of experience utterly useless. And then a tired waitress in a coffee-stained uniform walked past the room, glanced inside, and everything changed. Before we continue with this incredible story, I want to invite you to join our Soul Light Stories family by hitting that subscribe button. If this story touches your heart, please give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you, and your stories of kindness inspire us to keep sharing these moments that remind us what really matters. Nobody at Mercy General Hospital in downtown Boston knew what to do with Emma Hartfield. At 8 years old, she had become a medical mystery that defied every diagnosis, every treatment plan, every expert opinion that money could buy. Her father, Richard Hartfield, had built a tech empire worth billions, and he would have traded every penny of it to hear his daughter's voice again. Emma hadn't spoken in 4 months. She hadn't made eye contact. She barely ate. She moved through the world like a ghost, present but utterly unreachable, locked away in some inner prison that nobody could penetrate. It had started the night her mother died in a car accident, a tragedy so sudden and brutal that it seemed to have severed Emma's connection to the world entirely. Richard had done what he knew how to do. He threw money at the problem. He flew in specialists from Switzerland, from Japan, from Johns Hopkins and Mayo Clinic, child psychologists, trauma experts, neurologists. They ran every test imaginable. Brain scans came back normal. Physically, Emma was perfectly healthy, but something inside her had broken in a way that science couldn't measure or medicine couldn't fix. The doctors used words like selective mutism, severe dissociative disorder, traumatic catatonia. They prescribed medications with names Richard couldn't pronounce. They recommended intensive therapy programs, specialized facilities, experimental treatments. Nothing worked. Emma remained unreachable, a beautiful statue of a little girl who had once laughed and danced and filled their home with joy. Richard had taken a leave from his company, something he'd never done in 20 years of building his empire. He spent every day at the hospital, sleeping in the chair beside Emma's bed, watching her stare at nothing, hoping for the smallest sign that his daughter was still in there somewhere. He read her favorite books aloud. He played her favorite songs. He brought in her stuffed animals from home, arranged them carefully on her bed. She never looked at them. The nurses tried to be encouraging, but Richard could see the pity in their eyes. He'd overheard 2 doctors talking in the hallway late one night, their voices low but not low enough. One of them said that sometimes, after severe trauma, children retreated so far into themselves that they never fully came back. The other had simply nodded in sad agreement. On the 4th floor of Mercy General, in a tiny break room that smelled of burnt coffee and exhaustion, Claire Morrison poured herself her 3rd cup of terrible hospital cafeteria coffee and tried to calculate if she could afford to fix her car's broken taillight this month. Probably not. Her shift at Joe's Diner ended at 2 in the afternoon, and then she came straight here to work. Another 6 hours cleaning rooms and delivering meal trays, and the money still barely covered rent and her grandmother's medications. Claire was 26 and looked older. Life had a way of aging you when you worked 2 jobs, slept 5 hours a night, and carried the weight of keeping your family afloat entirely on your own shoulders. Her grandmother had raised her after her parents died when she was 12, and now Claire was returning the favor, working herself to the bone to keep them in their tiny apartment and make sure Grandma Rose had everything she needed. She didn't complain. Complaining didn't pay bills or make life fairer. She just kept moving, kept working, kept showing up even when her feet ached, and her back screamed, and she was so tired she could barely see straight. The doctors and nurses at Mercy General barely noticed her. She was just part of the furniture, the tired woman in the faded blue uniform who emptied the trash and mopped the floors. But Claire noticed things. She noticed the businessman who'd been sleeping in room 847 for weeks. Now his expensive suit wrinkled, his face haggard with grief. She noticed the little girl who never moved, never spoke, never seemed to see the world around her. She noticed the way the man would sit beside the girls, bed every evening and read to her, his voice cracking with emotion, his hands trembling as he turned the pages. It broke her heart in a way she couldn't quite explain. She'd seen plenty of sad things in hospitals. You couldn't work in a place like this without witnessing suffering, but something about this particular father and daughter haunted her. Maybe it was the way the man looked at his child with such desperate, helpless love. Maybe it was the emptiness in the little girl's eyes, a kind of absence that seemed too heavy for such a small person to carry. One evening, Claire was delivering dinner trays to the 4th floor when she passed room 847. The door was open, and she could see Richard Hartfield sitting beside Emma's bed, holding a children's book. He was reading a story about a brave little rabbit, but his voice kept breaking. He would pause, take a shaky breath, and continue. The little girl sat propped against her pillows, staring at the wall, completely motionless. Claire shouldn't have stopped. She had 20 more trays to deliver, and she was already running behind. But her feet wouldn't move. She stood in the doorway, watching this broken father try so desperately to reach his unreachable child, and something inside her chest cracked open. She thought about her own father. She'd been 12 when he died, old enough to remember everything. She remembered how the world had gone gray and silent, how nothing had seemed real, how she'd wanted to disappear into herself and never come out. She remembered the emptiness, the sense that if she let herself feel anything at all, she would shatter into a million pieces. And she remembered the thing that had finally brought her back. Not therapy or medication or time. It was her grandmother sitting beside her bed night after night. Not trying to fix her or make her talk, just being there. Just loving her without demanding anything in return. Just making her feel safe enough to eventually, slowly, carefully, peek back out at the world. Claire knocked softly on the doorframe. Richard looked up, surprised. Visitors and staff usually buzzed in and out of Emma's room on schedules and routines, but nobody just stopped to knock anymore. He saw a young woman in a hospital uniform holding a dinner tray, with dark circles under her eyes and the most genuine, kind expression he'd seen in months. She said, "Excuse me," she was so sorry to interrupt, but she couldn't help overhearing the story he was reading. It was one of her favorites when she was little. Richard managed a tired smile and said his daughter used to love it too. Used to, past tense. The words hung heavy in the air. Claire asked if she could come in for just a moment. Richard, too exhausted to question why, nodded. She set down her tray cart and walked over to Emma's bed, not too close, respecting the invisible boundary that seemed to surround the child. She didn't try to make eye contact or touch her. She just stood there, quietly, and then she started humming. It was a simple melody, something old and gentle. A lullaby that her grandmother used to sing. She didn't think about it, didn't plan it. It just came out, soft and low and unexpectedly soothing in the sterile hospital room. Richard watched, frozen, as this stranger hummed to his daughter. And then something impossible happened. Emma's eyes moved. Just slightly, just a flicker, but they moved. It was the first voluntary movement Richard had seen her make in weeks. His breath caught in his throat. Claire kept humming, keeping her voice steady and gentle. She hummed the whole lullaby through, and when she finished, she said softly that she had to get back to work, but maybe she'd stop by again tomorrow if that was okay. Richard could barely speak. He managed to whisper, "Yes, please, yes." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He kept replaying those few seconds in his mind. Emma's eyes had moved. She had responded to something. It was tiny, barely noticeable, but it was something. It was the first crack in the wall that had surrounded her for months. Claire came back the next evening and the evening after that. She would stop by room 847 during her break, always bringing something small, a smooth pebble she'd found that was nice to hold, a picture she'd drawn of a garden, a plastic butterfly that caught the light. She never pushed, never demanded response. She would just sit quietly nearby, sometimes humming, sometimes talking in a low, gentle voice about nothing in particular. She told Emma about the stray cat that lived behind her apartment building, how she'd been leaving, out food for it, and the cat was finally starting to trust her. She described the flowers blooming in the park, the way the evening light turned the clouds pink and gold. She talked about her grandmother, how she made the best apple pie in the world and was teaching Claire the secret recipe. Richard watched all of this with growing amazement. The expensive doctors had tried everything clinical, everything by the book, everything evidence-based. But they'd all treated Emma like a problem to be solved, a puzzle to be figured out. Claire treated her like a person, like someone worth talking to, even if she couldn't talk back, like someone whose silence deserved respect, not just intervention. On the 5th day, Claire brought a small music box that had belonged to her grandmother. She wound it up and let it play, its tiny mechanical song filling the quiet room. And Emma turned her head. She actually turned her head to look at the music box, and for just a second, the emptiness in her eyes seemed to flicker with something. That might have been curiosity. Richard felt tears streaming down his face. Claire pretended not to notice, just kept winding up the music box, letting it play, giving Emma all the space and time she needed. Over the following weeks, something remarkable began to unfold. Claire kept visiting every evening, always brief, always gentle, never pushing. And Emma began to slowly, incrementally emerge from wherever she'd been hiding. First, it was just eye movements. Then one day, she reached out and touched the music box. Her fingers were shaky, uncertain, but they moved with purpose. The doctors were astounded. They started asking Claire what she was doing, what technique she was using, what her training was. She told them she worked 2 jobs and barely finished high school. She didn't have any training. She was just spending time with Emma, just being there. But Richard understood. He'd spent months trying to fix his daughter, trying to bring her back through sheer force of will and unlimited resources. Claire had done something much simpler and infinitely harder. She'd met Emma where she was. She'd sat with her in the silence and the pain without trying to rush her out of it. She'd shown her that it was safe to come back, that the world could be gentle, that someone could see her suffering and not turn away. One evening, 3 weeks after Claire had first hummed that lullaby, she was sitting beside Emma's bed, winding up the music box as she always did, and Emma's lips moved. It was barely a whisper, so quiet that Claire almost missed it. But Emma said, "Pretty." One word. After 4 months of silence, one small, tentative word. Claire's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Richard, who had his hand pressed over his mouth, his whole body shaking with silent sobs. She turned back to Emma and said very softly, "Yes, sweetheart." "It is pretty." From that day forward, Emma began to speak again. Slowly at first, just a word here and there. But the wall had cracked, and gradually it began to crumble. She started making eye contact. She started eating. She started coming back to life. The doctors called it a breakthrough. They wrote papers about the case, discussed the inexplicable nature of her recovery. But Richard knew exactly what had happened. A young woman who had every reason to be bitter about life, who worked herself to exhaustion just to survive, had chosen to give his daughter the one thing all his money couldn't buy. She'd given her time, patience, and genuine human connection. Richard tried to thank Claire, tried to find ways to repay her. He offered her money, a job, anything she needed. But Claire just shook her head. She said she didn't do it for any reward. She did it because she remembered being a child who'd lost everything and needed someone to just be there. She did it because Emma deserved to be seen and loved, not as a problem or a tragedy, but as a person. But Richard was persistent. When he learned about Claire's 2 jobs, her sick grandmother, her struggling finances, he quietly paid off her rent for a year. He set up a fund for her grandmother's medical care. He created a position at his company for Claire, something that paid well and had reasonable hours if she ever wanted it. Not as payment, he insisted, but because someone who had such capacity for kindness deserved to not spend. Her life drowning in exhaustion, Claire was overwhelmed. She cried when she learned what he'd done. She told him it was too much, that she couldn't accept it. But he said, please, let him do this. Let him honor what she'd given his daughter. She'd given Emma her life back. The least he could do was give Claire a chance at a better one. Emma left the hospital 6 weeks after Claire first walked into her room. She still had a long journey ahead of her, still needed therapy and support and time to heal. But she was talking, laughing, engaging with the world again. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. On Emma's last day at Mercy General, Claire came to say goodbye. Emma ran to her and wrapped her small arms around Claire's waist. Holding on tight, she said, "Thank you for the music. Thank you for the stories. Thank you for being her friend when she couldn't be a friend back." Claire knelt down and looked Emma in the eyes. She told her that she was the bravest person Claire had ever met, and that sometimes being brave meant just surviving the day, just keeping going even when everything hurt. She said Emma's mother would be so proud of her. Richard stood watching this exchange, his heart so full it ached. He'd learned something profound in these past months. He'd learned that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought or scheduled or optimized. Connection, healing, love. These things happened in the quiet moments, in the spaces between, when someone chose to show up not because they had to, but because they saw someone suffering and decided to sit with them in it. Claire continued working at Mercy General for another year before she took Richard up on his offer of a position at his company. She became the director of his new foundation, one dedicated to providing support for families dealing with childhood trauma and grief. She built programs that trained people not in clinical techniques, but in the art of simply being present, in showing up, in meeting people where they are. Emma thrived. She returned to school, made friends, learned to carry her grief without being crushed by it. She never forgot those dark months, but they became part of her story, not the end of it. And she never forgot the tired woman in the faded uniform who had seen her when she was invisible, who had sung to her when she was silent, who had believed she was still in there somewhere, worth waiting for. Years later, when Emma was asked what she wanted to be when she grew up, she said she wanted to help people the way Claire had helped her. She wanted to show up for people who felt unreachable. She wanted to sit with them in the dark places and remind them, without words if necessary, that they weren't alone. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always come from experts with advanced degrees or expensive treatments, though these certainly have their place. Sometimes healing comes from the most unexpected sources. From a waitress who stops in a hospital room and hums a lullaby. From someone who's known their own darkness and can sit comfortably in someone else's. From acts of kindness that cost nothing but time and attention and genuine care. We live in a world that tells us we need credentials to help people, that we need resources and training and official permission to make a difference. But the truth is, we all have something invaluable to offer. We all have the ability to see someone who's suffering and choose not to look away. We have the capacity to be present, to be patient, to be gentle with the broken places in others because we know our own broken places too. Claire didn't save Emma because she had special skills or knowledge. She saved her because she had empathy, because she remembered what it felt like to need someone to just be there, and because she chose to give what she most needed when she was young and lost and alone in her grief. That's the thing about kindness. It often flows from our own wounds, from the understanding that suffering creates, from the wisdom that only comes through walking through dark valleys ourselves. Today, somewhere in your life, there's probably someone who seems unreachable. Someone struggling, someone lost, someone locked away in their own private pain. You might think you have nothing to offer them. You might feel unqualified, inadequate, too busy, too tired, too broken yourself. But maybe that's exactly what makes you the right person. Maybe your presence, your willingness to show up without trying to fix everything, your gentle patience, maybe that's the medicine they need most. We'd love to hear your stories. Have you ever been helped by an unexpected act of kindness? Have you reached someone others thought was unreachable? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The reminder that even in our darkest moments, we're never truly alone, and that healing can come from the most surprising places if we just remain open to it.